Hello friends! Ever wonder how digital brushes compare to their traditional counterparts? Well, it's time to find out. In this video, I'm teaming up with one of my talented artist friends to compare traditional versus digital watercolor. Meet Ohn Mar. She's an incredible watercolor artist known for her loose and expressive style, and she's a prolific painter, having filled more than 60 sketchbooks with her daily painting practice. In case this is your first time watching one of my videos, I'm Gia Graham and I create digital art primarily in the Procreate app. I often incorporate lush flowers and foliage in my nature-inspired artwork. Ohn Mar and I will both use the same photo as a reference, and we will walk you through our process as we each create a painting in our own mediums. Let's start with the supplies and setup.
This is my watercolor pan. It's a professional quality set, and it's a mixture of Schmincke, Winsor & Newton, Holbein, and a bit of Daniel Smith. These are the brushes that I'll be using. They are by ProArte, and these are quill brushes. I do have my name on them. They are branded brushes. It's my collaboration, and they are number 2, number 0, and 2/0, and this is the smallest one. So I'm not sure if I'll use all 3, but they're there in case.
I'm working on an iPad Pro using the Procreate app. And the first thing I'm going to do is add a paper texture background to help create a more realistic watercolor look. I'll leave a link in the description for where I found this and several other paper textures for free. The specific background I'm using from that set is called Cold Press Arctic. I didn't do a lot of extensive brush testing because I really wanted to challenge myself to experiment and work things out on camera. So I just did a few really quick stroke tests and decided to use a combination of 3 different default brushes from Procreate's watercolor brush set. I'll be using Gagebrook, which I've already done a review video for, Tansy, and Bridgewater.
So I'm going to start off by mixing a really light wash of orange just to get the shapes in, and I don't tend to draw anything. I'm a food illustrator by trade, so I study shapes of fruit and vegetables quite a lot, and I'm mindful to keep the highlight on those oranges because that really helps. Just realize they're not oranges, they're probably clementines. They're not exactly fully rounded, so that will do for now for that one. And this one is a half orange. Yeah, I'm just going to add an outline just so that I know where to place the 3rd orange. This might be a tad too big, but I can sort that out a little bit later on. And the 3rd one, I'm running out of wash. I do have to work fast because I want to get some pigments to move within these areas that I've just put down. The watercolor can't move where there's no prior water.
I'm going to start with a pencil sketch, just because my brain prefers to have a plan in place, so that when I start experimenting with the different painting brushes, I'll have one less thing to think about and to try to figure out on the spot. In case you're curious, I'm using the 6B pencil, which is a default brush from Procreate's classic library. Almost done here. I am going to add a few extra leaves. These weren't in the reference photo, but it will help to balance the composition. Okay, sketch is done. I'm going to start by painting the basic shapes in a mid-tone orange. I'm using the Gagebrook brush here, and if you watched my review video for this brush, you'll remember that it's semi-transparent, so it's not going to mimic a really light wash. It's more of a medium consistency. I decided to start with this brush because it will give me nice clean strokes and it's easy to control, so I can quickly get these shapes down.
So let's increase the pigment ratio. So this is what I would call cream. Yeah, let's start off with the 2 whole oranges and go around the outside, and you can see immediately that it's starting to blend in. And this one, I probably should have started with this one. I'm going to increase the pigment in that. Just bump it up a bit, because this area of the clementine is a bit more in shadow, so we have to look at the value contrast. And this one around the edges is probably, I could use the same, so I'm just adding a tiny bit of red. I know we can talk about colour theory, but I tend to just boost the pigment for ease. Looking at the value around here, I'm just wet my brush to get rid of the pigment that was on there. I'm just going to combine those pigments together. Pick up a smaller brush and get a green, a dark green down for the stalk, which is about here. Actually, I've just noticed the other one has got like this kind of star pattern, and it is one of the little recognizable features, so let's add that. Okay, that's really nice actually. I like that one. Now, while I've got this smaller brush in my hand, I'm going to go in and add those kind of folds that you see radiating outwards. The more I look at this, the more information that I'm able to pick up. This value-wise, this area here and this area here on each of the oranges is the darkest. So I think I'm going to have to use a purple or maybe a violet to get the value just so. Let's see what happens. Because the pigments are still damp, they're not super wet, they're damp, I can sort of play around with it, and I tend to just drop them in. This is getting a little bit drier than what I normally work with, but it's damp enough that the pigments can still move around. You won't know until the whole thing is dry what's really going on. You can guess. Okay. Yep, that one looks good. These two areas need to be a little bit more involved with each other. They look a bit too separate at the moment, so let's combine that. I think this particular satsuma is a little bit flat. Just going to bring the edge of that up to there. Oh, they're looking really good actually. So while I'm waiting for those to dry a little bit more, because I can't add more pigment without, I think I would start to overwork. That's one of the problems with watercolor, knowing when to leave well alone. Okay, so we can use that time to add the segments within this half orange, and it's got this starburst pattern inside, which is really nice to see. I want to preserve the white because the membranes between each segment is so thin. That's trickier for sure, but let's keep on doing this. Because of it being a translucent medium, it's so easy to overwork. Oh, I'm not sure if I'm going to get these segments quite right. Ideally, they would have lovely white sections in between the membranes, but they're still identifiable, which is great. I'm just going to do it like that. That's not bad, eh? You notice that I started with quite a light wash, but let's bump it up, especially in these upper segments. They are just that little bit heavier, boosting the pigment ratio so that it's a lot more orange, and I think we're going to use the same sort of violet. They look great. If I just pop that in here, and at the same time I'll just make that segment a tiny bit more curved. Oh yes, that looks really, really nice.
All right, let's add some contrast with a nice bright orange. I'm going to switch to Tansy, which is a much more transparent brush, and I'll just kind of block in the areas of shadow. With traditional watercolor, I think you'd typically start with a light wash and then add to that with a thicker consistency, but I'm kind of doing the opposite here. Digital brushes are not going to work in the same way as actual watercolor paint, so you kind of have to experiment and figure out different ways to achieve the look. Ooh, I like that. This brush is pressure sensitive, so if I adjust the pressure along the stroke, it can create that nice little teardrop shape. Now I'm going to switch over to the smudge tool and also set that to the Tansy brush and try to blend some of these areas to soften the edges. Now this part is always tricky for me because it's hard to tell if I'm blending too much or not enough. You know, I want to soften those edges, but I don't want to make it look like a muddy mess. So I'm just going to leave that right there. And I'm going to follow the same process for this one as well. All right, let me soften some of these edges. Again, I'm using the smudge tool, same brush. I do still want to keep this area white for the highlight, but I'm just going to blend that color in to soften the transition. I kind of want to see what happens if I add a little yellow. I like it. I'm not sure how that would work with traditional watercolor. Can you paint a light wash over a vibrant color in traditional watercolor? I don't know. Okay, now for these segments in the orange slice, I'm using the Gauge Brook brush. Again, it's easier to control. And I'm keeping my strokes light and loose because I want to maintain those slight shifts in value. It just looks more realistic if the color doesn't get too flat and solid. Those segments are kind of wonky and off center, but that's okay. I really like how the center turned out, so I'm not going to change anything. I've dropped the size of the Gauge Brook brush down quite a bit so I can get a relatively clean line for the rind. Now I've switched back to Tansy for a second because I think it will be perfect to soften that inner edge of the rind here. I can make the feathery edges and transparency of this brush work to my advantage here.
Looking at going back to these, they're still not as dry as I'd like, so I don't think it's safe to go in there with another layer at this stage. So I'm going to add the leaves. Let's go back to the 0. So mixing up a permanent green, olive green, and the stalk comes up from there. If I press down pretty hard with the brush, I want the pigments to mingle, so I can't spend too much time faffing with the shape of these leaves. Oh, it doesn't matter that they're touching. I think I will do them sort of going off the page. I might add another leaf down at the bottom just for balance. Yeah, I do want one. That's nice. I do think that it would be nice if there was more green leaves here. It's I know it's not in the reference image, but I can't help being a food illustrator. And let's say there's don't know what angle. Okay, that's nice. So we do want to add the dark background. So let's mix up a Payne's grey. Payne's grey and indigo looks so similar. I'd like it just a little bit warmer. I'm going to add some brown to that because the oranges are quite warm and Payne's Grey is relatively cool colour. Oh, you know what I just realised I was going to do? I was going to drop in more yellow to make the leaves a little bit more dimensional while they were wet. I completely forgot. I was thinking, yeah, I'd mix the Payne's Grey because I like to see the pigments mix within each shape that I've just put down, and you have to time it. When you've been watercolouring as long as me, you'll know when's the right time to add pigment in order for it to play around on the page. Oh, I'm glad I remembered in time. And a darker green, I think, on this side here. They're not going to spread as much as I hoped because they have just started drying, which is fine. I managed to catch it just in time. Right, okay, good.
Let's tackle the leaves next. I'm going to try a different brush for this. Let's see what the Bridgewater brush does. I'm going to start with really loose shapes in a light green and then build on that. So this brush sits somewhere between the other two brushes I've been using thus far. It's quite transparent, like tansy, but it has cleaner edges, somewhat like Gauge Brook. And if you drop the brush size down, you get the best of both worlds because you can get nice, clean, easy to control strokes, but it still has a decent amount of transparency, so you still get that watercolor look. I'll use Tansy to add the darker values and then blend. Just a little though. I'll follow that same process for the rest of the leaves, starting with the Bridgewater brush to define the shape, then switching to the Tansy brush to add the deeper values and to blend.
Now I can go back to the background. So I'm using the number 2 quill, which allows me to cover a much larger area. I'm not going right up to the orange, but fairly close to the edge. The great thing about the quill brush is it does come to a lovely point. That's one of the reasons why I use them. I could have done this painting with just this number 2 quill brush, but it does involve an incredible amount of control. Almost there with the background, actually. Just this section here. That looks really fab. Right, this edge here is getting too lost, so I just need to bump up the orange on the zest. That's better. Yeah, I think just in certain sections, I don't need to go around the whole thing because the human brain can handle suggestions. It looks really vibrant. I'm so pleased with how this has turned out. One last look at the value contrast. I think I could go and fetch my hairdryer, but I'm kind of in the flow now. I'm just going to boost that value contrast just a tiny bit more here and there. These segments, sorry, I don't know what you call them, around the stalk. If I can just work out how to add that information, that would really help. It's just playing with values, really. Light and dark. Human eye is really good at perceiving that. That doesn't look too bad. Right, just the final faff. There's always a final faff. That line's a little bit too strong. I'm just going to merge it in. Right, right. Not bad, not bad.
I just realized I forgot to add some of the darker values in these segments, so I'm going to do that with the Tansy brush in this really bright orange. And I have to add that little green section where the stem was attached. I've got the Bridgewater brush set to a really small size for this. I'll add some yellow for highlight and a darker green. I also think I need to bump up the contrast even more in some areas. And that's one of the challenges I'm finding with digital watercolor. The brushes tend to be more muted in order to give that transparent look. So you really have to put in a lot of extra work to get some areas to look more saturated. You know, with traditional watercolor, if you want more saturation, you can just add more pigment. Anyway, I think that looks better. Now I'm going to add that dark color to the background. Let's see, I'll use this dark charcoal gray, and I think I'll use the Gauge Book brush for this. I'm working on a separate layer below the oranges, and of course, the brushes I used were very transparent, so you can see right through them. So this means I'm going to have to underpaint this. I can just create a new layer between the oranges and the background color. And I'm going to use white, but I need to use an opaque brush for this underpainting. So I'm going to use a brush from the gouache set. Let's try Bottlenose. So I'm basically just tracing all of the shapes and painting everything below in the white. Of course, traditionally you would start with an underpainting, but this is one of the perks about working digitally. And it's okay if the white bleeds beyond the edges a little. It actually makes it look a little more authentic, because if this were a traditional painting, there would be some space there where the two edges meet. The last thing I'm going to do is add a little shadow. So I'm going to create another layer right below the underpainting, and I'm going to use the Bridgewater brush to drop these shadows in. That little bit of contrast really helps to ground everything and give it more depth. All right, I think I'm done. Let's see both paintings side by side. Not only is it interesting to see the same painting in two different mediums, it's also quite interesting to see them in two completely different styles. I think they're both beautiful in their own right. It's also clear that both mediums have their own pros and cons. With traditional watercolor, you get that beautiful mingling of pigment when you work wet on wet, which brings a spontaneity that's hard to capture digitally. Of course, I do also think that that has a lot to do with Ohn Mar's signature style. She has a really lovely way of letting the paint play on the page. On the other hand, you do have some limitations with traditional watercolor. It's easy to miss your window of opportunity if your paint dries before you're ready. Or you might have to break your flow and stop and wait for paint to dry. On the digital side, one of the pros is that you don't have those time restraints, no drying time. Mistakes can easily be fixed, and since you can work in layers, you have more freedom to experiment without completely ruining a piece. Of course, on the flip side of that, it's really hard to replicate that beautiful mingling of paint that comes naturally with traditional watercolor. I do feel like there is a brush out there somewhere that might give a close approximation. I just haven't found it yet. Let me know in the comments if any of you have cracked the code on that. I really enjoyed this exercise. Thank you, Ohn Mar, for painting with me and joining me for this experiment. If you'd like to see more of Ohn Mar's work, you can check out her YouTube channel, watch her online watercolor classes, or join her on Patreon. I left links in the description for all the places where you can find her. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love if you'd give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.